The quiet guardian. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what felt like the 100th time. The heavy black bearskin hat sat firmly on his head, and his polished boots reflected the early light like mirrors. To the hundreds of tourists already gathering behind the iron gates, he was just another ceremonial guard, a living statue in an elaborate costume. James had been standing at his post for 2 hours already, his rifle held at the perfect angle, his face a mask of stoic professionalism. The tourists loved to try to make the guards break character. They would make funny faces, tell jokes, wave frantically, and sometimes even try to touch the guards or their weapons. James had seen it all in his 3 years of ceremonial duty. What the tourists didn't know, what his fellow ceremonial guards didn't know, and what even most of his military colleagues didn't know, was that James Mitchell was far more than just a man in a fancy red uniform. Hidden beneath the ceremonial exterior was one of the most lethal marksmen the British military had ever produced. James had spent 8 years in the Special Air Service, the elite SAS regiment that operated in the shadows, while guards like him stood in the spotlight. His record was classified at the highest levels, known only to a select few in military intelligence. In the mountains of Afghanistan, the deserts of Iraq, and in classified operations across 3 continents, James had earned a reputation that would have shocked anyone watching him stand motionless outside the palace. He was known in certain circles as the Ghost, a sniper who could make impossible shots in impossible conditions. His longest confirmed kill was at 2,475 meters, a shot that had saved an entire convoy of British soldiers from an ambush. He had 47 confirmed eliminations, each one a calculated decision that had saved countless innocent lives. His shooting skills were so extraordinary that he had been personally requested for missions by American Delta Force, French GIGN, and German GSG-9. But James had grown tired of the shadows, tired of the weight of secrets, and tired of the psychological toll that came with his particular set of skills. When the opportunity came to transfer to ceremonial duties, he took it gladly. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now carried an unloaded rifle for show while tourists took pictures, when just 2 years ago he was carrying a weapon that could reach out and touch someone from over a mile away. The morning crowd was particularly energetic today. A group of American college students had positioned themselves right in front of his post, phones out, trying every trick in the book to get a reaction. James maintained his perfect posture, staring straight ahead as they made silly faces and cracked jokes about his hat. "I bet these guys can't even shoot," one of the students said loudly, clearly hoping for a reaction. "They're just for show, right? Like, what would happen if someone actually tried to attack? These guys would probably miss a barn door from 10 feet away?" His friends laughed, emboldened by their companion's boldness. "Yeah, look at that rifle. It probably doesn't even work. It's probably just a prop, like everything else about this whole thing. Pure theater for the tourists." James's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his training in both the SAS and ceremonial duties kept his face perfectly neutral. He had learned long ago that people often said things they didn't mean when they were trying to impress their friends or get a reaction. These were just kids having fun, completely unaware of the man they were mocking. The group continued their commentary, growing bolder with each passing minute. "I bet my little sister could outshoot any of these guys," another student chimed in. "They probably spend all day practicing how to stand still instead of actually learning how to use those weapons. It's all just costume and no substance." A British family nearby overheard the comments and seemed uncomfortable with the disrespect being shown, but they said nothing. This was unfortunately common. Tourists often forgot that these were real soldiers, real people with real feelings and real skills, not just attractions in a theme park. What made the situation particularly ironic was that James's rifle, while unloaded for ceremonial purposes, was indeed fully functional. More importantly, James could have field-stripped, cleaned, loaded, and fired it with deadly accuracy faster than any of these tourists could have taken a selfie. In his SAS days, he had regularly trained with the standard British Army L-85A2 rifle, though he preferred the more specialized weapons available to special forces. The real humor, if it could be called that, was in what these students didn't understand about the nature of military service. Every one of the guards they were mocking had been through rigorous military training. They were soldiers first, ceremonial guards second. Many had seen combat, though perhaps not to the extent that James had. They were volunteers from various regiments, including the Grenadier Guards, Coldstream Guards, Scots Guards, Irish Guards, and Welsh Guards. Each had proven themselves worthy of representing the crown in this highly visible role. But James was different even among this group of proven soldiers. His background was so classified that not even his commanding officer in the ceremonial unit knew the full extent of his previous service. His transfer papers simply indicated previous service with special duties, a bureaucratic euphemism that could mean anything from intelligence work to VIP protection. As the American students continued their commentary, James found his mind wandering to a dusty compound in Helmand Province where he had once taken out 3 Taliban snipers with 3 consecutive shots in under 15 seconds, each target over 800 meters away. The memory wasn't pleasant, it never was, but it served as a stark contrast to his current situation. The tourists had no way of knowing that the man they were mocking had been personally decorated by both the Queen and the American Secretary of Defense. They couldn't know that his shooting skills had been the subject of a classified study by military researchers trying to understand how human reflexes and training could be pushed to such extraordinary limits. They had no idea that weapons manufacturers sometimes consulted with him when developing new sniper systems. A new group joined the original American students, this time a mix of German and French tourists who seemed equally amused by the perceived helplessness of the ceremonial guards. The language barrier didn't prevent them from joining in the universal tourist sport of trying to break a guard's concentration. One of the German visitors, a man in his 40s wearing an expensive camera around his neck, spoke in heavily accented English. In Germany, our soldiers are trained for real combat, not playing dress-up. These British guards, they are like dolls, no? Very pretty, but not useful for anything real. James's eye twitched slightly, but his discipline held firm. He had tremendous respect for German military forces, having worked alongside them in Afghanistan. He knew this tourist was speaking from ignorance, not malice, but the comment still stung. The French tourists were more subtle, but equally dismissive. They spoke in rapid French among themselves, apparently assuming that the guards wouldn't understand them. James, who was fluent in French from his SAS linguistic training, caught every word of their commentary about British military incompetence and their amusement at the toy soldiers standing guard. What these tourists couldn't see was the network of highly trained protection officers, armed police, and military personnel who provided the real security for the palace. The ceremonial guards were indeed ceremonial, but they were far from helpless, and they were backed by one of the most sophisticated security operations in the world. James thought about his SAS teammates, men and women who would find this situation hilariously ironic. They knew him as a ghost who could appear anywhere, eliminate any target, and disappear without a trace. Now he was standing perfectly still while tourists took pictures and questioned his competence with weapons. The morning was getting warmer, and James could feel sweat beginning to form under his heavy ceremonial uniform. The bearskin hat, made from real Canadian black bear fur, was designed more for intimidation and tradition than comfort. But he had endured far worse conditions in far more dangerous places. A little discomfort while standing in one of the safest, most protected locations in London was hardly a challenge. The crowd was growing larger as more tour groups arrived. James could see his fellow guards at their respective posts, each maintaining the same perfect discipline despite the increasing noise and activity around them. These men were his brothers in arms, even if they didn't know about his special background. They deserved better than the casual disrespect they were receiving. As the sun climbed higher and the morning wore on, James began to think about what his life had become. 3 years ago, he had been crawling through enemy territory with a 50-pound pack and a rifle that could reach out over a mile. Now he stood in wool and brass while tourists debated his professional competence. He didn't regret his decision to leave the SAS. The psychological toll of that work was real, and he had seen too many good soldiers consumed by it. But days like this made him wonder if he had swung too far in the opposite direction. Perhaps there was a middle ground between the shadows of special operations and the fishbowl existence of ceremonial duty. The American students were still there, now joined by what appeared to be their parents or older relatives. The older Americans seemed more respectful, but they didn't intervene when the younger ones continued their commentary about the guards' supposed incompetence with weapons. James found himself thinking about a particular mission in Syria where his shooting had prevented a terrorist attack that would have killed hundreds of civilians. The shot had been at extreme range in challenging conditions, and it had taken every bit of his skill and training to make it count. The irony of being mocked for his marksmanship while standing just a few feet from people whose lives might have depended on those very skills was not lost on him. But this was his choice now. He had volunteered for this duty, knowing full well what it entailed. The tourists weren't trying to be cruel. They simply didn't understand what they were looking at. To them, he was a piece of living history, a colorful tradition that existed for their entertainment and education. They had no context for understanding that beneath the ceremony lay very real military capability. As the first part of his long day continued, James steeled himself for more of the same. The crowds would grow larger, the comments would continue, and he would stand at his post with perfect discipline, protecting secrets that would probably shock the very people questioning his competence. It was, he reflected, perhaps the most elaborate form of hiding in plain sight ever devised. When worlds collide. The afternoon sun was blazing down on the palace courtyard when everything changed. James had been at his post for nearly 6 hours, maintaining his perfect stance despite the growing heat and the increasingly bold comments from tourists. The morning crowd had given way to a different group, this time including some university students from a military academy who seemed particularly confident in their assessment of the ceremonial guard's abilities. "Look at these guys," said a tall young man wearing a military academy sweatshirt. "They stand around all day looking pretty, but I bet they couldn't hit water if they fell out of a boat. We train with real weapons, real tactics. These guys are just for show." His companions, similarly dressed and equally arrogant, nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it's all ceremony and no substance. I mean, when was the last time any of these guards saw real action? They probably spend more time polishing their boots than training with weapons." James felt a familiar tension building in his shoulders. These weren't just random tourists making ignorant comments. These were young military cadets who should know better, who were dismissing real soldiers based on their ceremonial role. The irony was almost painful. What these cadets didn't understand was that James had forgotten more about warfare and marksmanship than they had ever learned. While they were studying tactics in classrooms and practicing on shooting ranges under controlled conditions, James had been applying those skills in life-and-death situations where failure meant not just a poor grade, but dead teammates and civilians. The military academy students were joined by what appeared to be some of their instructors, older men who should have known better than to allow such disrespectful commentary about fellow service members. Instead, one of them actually encouraged the discussion. "You're right to question this, gentlemen," said a man with sergeant's stripes on his casual uniform. "Modern military service requires different skills than standing still and looking intimidating. These ceremonial roles are largely outdated, maintained more for tourism than for any real military purpose." James's jaw clenched involuntarily. This instructor was not just wrong, he was dangerously ignorant about the nature of military service and the background of the men he was casually dismissing. If he knew that one of the tourist attractions he was mocking had more confirmed kills than his entire class combined, he might think twice about his commentary. The crowd around the gates was growing restless, energized by the military academy group's bold statements. Other tourists began chiming in with their own opinions about the effectiveness of British ceremonial guards versus real soldiers. The atmosphere was becoming increasingly hostile, though still within the bounds of legal free speech. "I bet I could take that rifle away from him and he wouldn't even know how to respond," said one of the cadets, pointing directly at James. "They're probably not even allowed to move unless someone gives them permission. What kind of soldier needs permission to defend himself?" The comment hit closer to home than the young man could have possibly known. In the SAS, James had operated with almost complete autonomy, making split-second decisions that affected international relations and saved lives. The idea that he needed permission for anything would have been laughable to his former teammates. But the cadet wasn't entirely wrong about the restrictions. Ceremonial guards did operate under strict rules of engagement and protocol. They couldn't simply break character or respond to verbal provocation. Their role required them to maintain dignity and discipline no matter what was said or done around them, within legal limits. James found himself remembering a particular incident in Somalia, where he had been forced to take out a sniper who was targeting a UN medical convoy. The shot had been through a window at extreme range, with civilian lives hanging in the balance. He had made the decision and taken the shot without consulting anyone, because in that moment, consultation would have meant death for innocent people. The contrast between that autonomy and his current restriction was stark, but James had made this choice deliberately. He wanted a life where the most difficult decision he had to make was whether to acknowledge a tourist's question or maintain strict silence. A new voice joined the conversation, and this one made James's blood run cold. It belonged to a man with an American accent, someone who clearly had military experience based on his bearing and terminology. "I spent 2 tours in Afghanistan," the American said, "and I can tell you that guys like this wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real firefight. Combat is about quick thinking, rapid movement, and decisive action. These guys are trained to stand still and look pretty. Completely different skill sets." The American was partially right. Combat did require quick thinking and decisive action, but he was completely wrong about the men he was looking at. James had spent more time in combat zones than this American could have possibly imagined, and his record of decisive action under pressure was literally classified as a national security asset. What made the comment particularly galling was that James had actually saved American lives during joint operations. He had provided overwatch for U.S. Marines during urban combat operations, eliminated threats that American forces couldn't reach, and coordinated with U.S. Special Operations Command on missions that were still classified years later. The crowd was now openly debating the military effectiveness of ceremonial guards versus real soldiers. Phone cameras were recording everything, no doubt for social media posts mocking the British military's supposed emphasis on style over substance. James knew that these videos would be shared thousands of times, probably with captions about how British soldiers were all show and no action. If only they knew. If only these people could see the classified commendation letters, the mission reports, the evaluations from American, French, and German officers who had worked with James in the field. If they could read the testimony from soldiers whose lives he had saved, or from intelligence analysts whose information had been gathered under the protection of his overwatch. But that was exactly the point. They couldn't know, and they never would. James's real service record would remain classified long after he retired. The missions he had completed, the lives he had saved, the enemies he had eliminated, all of it would remain in locked files, known only to a select few with the highest security clearances. A British man in the crowd, apparently a veteran himself based on his bearing, tried to interject some reason into the discussion. "Look, I served with the parachute regiment for 12 years, and I can tell you that every one of these guards is a real soldier. They've all completed basic training, advanced infantry training, and many of them have combat experience. The ceremonial role doesn't diminish their military capabilities." James felt a moment of gratitude for this stranger's attempt to defend him and his fellow guards. The veteran was absolutely right. Ceremonial duty didn't erase military training or experience. If anything, it required additional discipline and skill to maintain perfect bearing under intense public scrutiny. But the military academy students weren't impressed. "Basic training was decades ago for most of these guys," one of them argued. "Skills deteriorate without use. When was the last time any of them fired a weapon in anger? When did they last have to make life-or-death decisions under pressure?" James almost smiled at the irony. His last combat engagement had been less than 3 years ago, shortly before his transfer to ceremonial duties. His last training session with SAS standards had been just 18 months ago, when he had been recalled for a consultation on sniper training protocols. His skills were not just maintained, they were sharper than ever. The American veteran continued his commentary, apparently encouraged by the attention he was receiving. "I'm telling you, modern warfare is about technology, communication, and split-second decision-making. These guys are trained for 18th century warfare. Look at them. They're carrying bolt-action rifles and standing in formation like it's Waterloo or something." This comment demonstrated such a fundamental misunderstanding of both modern military service and the nature of ceremonial duties that James had to actively control his facial expression. The rifles the guards carried were indeed not their primary weapons. That would be like judging a Formula One driver based on his performance in a parade car. More importantly, James's experience with modern warfare was probably more extensive than anyone else in the crowd. He had used satellite communication systems to coordinate strikes, operated advanced targeting systems, and worked with technology that most of these critics had only seen in movies. The discussion was drawing more attention, and palace security was beginning to take notice. James could see plainclothes protection officers moving closer, monitoring the situation to ensure it didn't escalate beyond verbal commentary. The last thing anyone wanted was a physical confrontation at one of London's most visible tourist attractions. But the military academy instructor seemed determined to make his point. "The real test of a soldier," he said loudly, "is how they perform under pressure, how accurately they can shoot under combat conditions, and how quickly they can adapt to changing tactical situations. Standing still in a fancy uniform doesn't demonstrate any of those capabilities." James found himself thinking about a mission in the Hindu Kush where he had tracked a high-value target for 3 days through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. When the shot had finally presented itself, it was at maximum range in high wind, with multiple friendly forces in the area. He had one opportunity, one bullet, to eliminate a threat that had been responsible for the deaths of dozens of Allied soldiers. The shot had been perfect, threading between 2 buildings and accounting for wind, elevation, and the movement of both the target and a civilian who had wandered into the area. It was the kind of shooting that existed more in fiction than reality, except James had made it real. 3 separate intelligence agencies had reviewed the mission and concluded that it was one of the most remarkable pieces of marksmanship in modern military history. Now he stood listening to a military instructor lecture him about performance under pressure and shooting accuracy, while tourists recorded the whole thing on their phones for entertainment. The irony reached a new level when one of the cadets pulled out what appeared to be a competition shooting trophy. "I won this at the regional marksmanship competition last month," he announced proudly. "Scored 487 out of 500 at 200 meters. I bet none of these guards could come close to that kind of accuracy." James had to bite the inside of his cheek to keep from reacting. In the SAS, they had a saying, "Amateurs practice until they get it right. Professionals practice until they can't get it wrong." This young man was proud of hitting stationary targets at known distances under perfect conditions. James had regularly made shots at unknown distances, in terrible conditions, at moving targets, with lives hanging in the balance. The crowd was growing larger and more animated. Word was spreading through the tourist groups that there was some kind of debate happening about the guards' military capabilities. People were positioning themselves to get better views and better video footage of what they apparently thought was some kind of entertainment. James could see his fellow guards at their posts, each maintaining perfect discipline despite the increasingly hostile commentary. These were good soldiers, professionals who deserved better than this public humiliation. They had volunteered for this duty knowing they would face scrutiny, but probably not expecting such organized criticism from people who should have known better. The situation was becoming surreal. Here were real soldiers being lectured about military effectiveness by students, while tourists recorded it all for social media. It was like watching professional athletes being criticized by fans who had never played the sport, except with the added element of service and sacrifice that these critics couldn't begin to understand. As the afternoon wore on, James realized that this was probably just the beginning. Social media would amplify these criticisms. Other military academies might see the videos and want to make their own statements. And the whole thing could spiral into a national debate about the value of ceremonial military traditions. What none of these critics could know was that they were looking at one of the most lethal soldiers the British military had ever produced, a man whose skills had been proven in the most demanding environments imaginable, standing quietly and professionally while they questioned his competence. The secret would remain safe, but the irony was almost unbearable. The moment of truth. It was nearly 5 o'clock when fate decided to intervene in the most dramatic way possible. James had endured almost 8 hours of commentary, criticism, and outright mockery from tourists and military academy students who had no idea they were questioning the competence of one of Britain's most decorated Special Forces veterans. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the courtyard, and the evening tour groups were arriving to replace the day crowds. Then the shots rang out. The sound was unmistakable to anyone with military training, the sharp crack of high-velocity rifle fire coming from somewhere beyond the palace gates. But these weren't ceremonial blanks or military exercises. These were real shots, and they were coming from the direction of St. James's Park. In an instant, everything changed. The jovial atmosphere of tourist photography and casual military debate evaporated as people began to scream and run in confusion. The palace security protocols that had been invisible to the tourists suddenly became very visible as armed police emerged from concealed positions and protection officers began shouting commands. James's training kicked in immediately, but he was caught between two different sets of protocols. As a ceremonial guard, he was supposed to maintain his position and await orders. As a former SAS operative, every instinct was screaming at him to assess the threat, identify the source of gunfire, and take appropriate action. Through the chaos, he could hear radio chatter from the security teams. Multiple shots had been fired from a building overlooking the park. There were reports of civilians down. The shooter appeared to be in an elevated position with a clear line of sight to several areas around the palace, including the ceremonial posts. The military academy instructor, who had been so confident in his criticism of the guards, was now crouched behind a concrete barrier, his face pale with fear. The students who had been mocking the guards' combat readiness were scattered and panicking, their theoretical knowledge proving useless in a real crisis situation. But James could see something that the security teams couldn't from their positions. Through gaps in the fleeing crowd and using sightlines he had unconsciously mapped during his hours of standing guard, he could identify the muzzle flashes. The shooter was approximately 800 meters away, firing from the fourth floor of a building that should have been evacuated and secured. More shots rang out, and James could see dust kicking up from impacts near the palace gates. The shooter was trying to target the ceremonial guards or the fleeing tourists. It was impossible to tell which. Either way, people were in immediate danger, and the normal security response was going to take too long to deploy. James made a decision that would have been impossible to explain to anyone who didn't understand his background. In one fluid motion, he broke from his ceremonial stance, ejected the blank ammunition from his rifle, and reached for the live magazine he kept concealed in his kit, a violation of protocol that he had hoped never to need. The tourists who had been mocking him moments before watched in amazement as the toy soldier transformed before their eyes. His movements were precise, economical, and faster than anyone thought possible. In less than 15 seconds, he had a loaded weapon and was moving to a position that would give him a clear shot at the sniper's location. "Jesus Christ," whispered one of the American tourists. "Look at him move." The military academy students, still pressed against whatever cover they could find, watched in stunned silence as James dropped into a shooting position that was textbook perfect. His breathing became controlled, his body went completely still, and his focus narrowed to the single point where he had identified the threat. The distance was challenging, but well within his capabilities. 800 meters with iron sights, elevated target, moving air, and the pressure of civilian lives at stake. It was exactly the kind of shot that had made him legendary in special operations circles. But now he would have to make it in full view of hundreds of witnesses, effectively blowing his cover and ending his quiet retirement from the shadows. Through his sights, James could see the shooter clearly. Male, early 30s, using what appeared to be a hunting rifle with a scope. The man was methodically engaging targets, showing training but not professional-level skills. This wasn't a terrorist with military background. This was someone with enough knowledge to be dangerous, but not enough discipline to be truly effective. The palace security teams were still positioning themselves for a response. Helicopter support was being called in. Specialist firearms officers were en route. All of this would take time that more civilians might not have as the shooter continued to fire into the crowds below. James could hear screaming from the direction of the park. Radio chatter indicated that at least 3 people had been hit, though their conditions were unknown. The shooter had position and momentum, and every second that passed gave him more opportunities to cause casualties. The wind was minimal, which was fortunate. The angle was slightly downward, which James calculated automatically. The target was partially concealed behind a window frame, leaving only a small area exposed. It would require a perfect shot, the kind that existed more in fiction than reality. Except James had made shots exactly like this before, under worse conditions, with higher stakes. He controlled his breathing, felt his heartbeat slow, and let his training take over. Years of SAS experience, thousands of hours of practice, dozens of real-world engagements, all of it condensed into this single moment when a ceremonial guard would have to become a sniper again. The military academy instructor, still crouched behind his barrier, found himself with a perfect view of James's shooting position. What he saw challenged everything he thought he knew about military bearing and training. The guard's stance was absolutely perfect. His control was complete, and his focus was so intense it was almost visible. "That's not possible," one of the cadets whispered. "How does he know how to do that?" James squeezed the trigger with the same precision that had made him famous in classified circles. The shot was perfect, exactly where he had aimed, exactly when he had intended. 800 meters away, the rifle fire from the building stopped immediately. The sudden silence was deafening. For a moment, nobody moved. The fleeing tourists stopped running and looked around in confusion. The security teams paused their deployment to assess the new situation. Even the radio chatter went quiet as everyone tried to understand what had just happened. James remained in position for another 30 seconds, maintaining his sight picture in case there were additional threats. Only when he was certain that the immediate danger had passed did he carefully safe his weapon and stand. The transformation back to ceremonial bearing was almost as shocking as the initial change had been. In seconds, James returned to perfect military posture, his rifle held at the correct angle, his face a mask of professional composure. To anyone who hadn't witnessed the preceding moments, he might have been just another guard maintaining his post. But hundreds of people had witnessed what just happened. Hundreds of phones had recorded it. The military academy students who had been questioning his competence were staring at him in disbelief. The American veteran who had claimed these guards couldn't last 5 minutes in combat was speechless. "Did that just actually happen?" asked one of the German tourists, his expensive camera forgotten in his hands. The palace security teams were already moving to secure the building where the shooter had been positioned. Initial reports indicated that the threat had been neutralized with a single shot at extreme range. The precision required for such a shot was being described by the firearms officers as extraordinary and impossible under these conditions. James could hear the approaching sirens of emergency services responding to the incident. There would be investigations, debriefings, media coverage, and probably commendations. His quiet retirement from special operations was effectively over. There was no way to explain what had just happened without revealing his background. The military academy instructor slowly stood up from behind his barrier, his face a mixture of embarrassment and amazement. I don't understand," he stammered. Where did you learn to shoot like that?" James maintained his ceremonial silence, staring straight ahead as protocol required. But the question hung in the air, along with dozens of others from the witnesses who had just seen something that challenged everything they thought they knew about ceremonial guards and military service. The American veteran who had been so confident in his criticism was shaking his head in disbelief. That shot, at that distance, with iron sights. In these conditions, he trailed off, unable to complete the thought. One of the cadets who had been bragging about his competition shooting trophy was staring at James with something approaching awe. His 487 out of 500 at 200 meters suddenly seemed embarrassingly amateur compared to what he had just witnessed. The British veteran who had tried to defend the guards earlier was smiling despite the seriousness of the situation. He had known that ceremonial guards were real soldiers, but even he had been unprepared for this level of skill and training. As the immediate crisis passed and normal security procedures resumed, James found himself thinking about the irony of the situation. For 8 hours, these people had questioned his competence, mocked his military abilities, and dismissed him as a glorified tourist attraction. Now they had seen exactly what he was capable of, and they had no context to understand it. The truth was that what they had witnessed was probably the most remarkable piece of marksmanship any of them would ever see. The distance, conditions, and pressure had combined to create a shot that would be analyzed and discussed in military circles for years to come. But they had no way of knowing that they had just watched one of the world's most elite snipers do what he did best. The media would undoubtedly try to identify the guard who had made the shot. Military officials would have to decide how much of James's background they could reveal without compromising classified operations. The whole incident would probably become a case study in both crisis response and the hidden capabilities of seemingly ceremonial military units. But for James, the most important thing was that the immediate threat had been stopped. Civilian lives had been saved. The shooter had been neutralized before he could cause more casualties. Everything else, the exposure, the questions, the end of his quiet anonymity, was secondary to that simple fact. As evening fell and the area was secured, James remained at his post, maintaining the same perfect discipline he had shown all day. The tourists and critics had been evacuated or were being interviewed by investigators. The military academy students were probably re-evaluating everything they thought they knew about military service and combat effectiveness. Tomorrow, the whole world would know that at least one of the ceremonial guards at Buckingham Palace was far more than he appeared to be. The secret that James had kept for 3 years was now exposed for all to see. His quiet retirement from the shadows was over, and he would have to face whatever came next. But tonight, he had reminded everyone, including himself, exactly who Sergeant James Mitchell really was beneath the red tunic and bearskin hat. He was the Ghost, one of Britain's most lethal soldiers, and no amount of ceremonial duty could change that fundamental truth. The tourists who had teased him about his aim had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving, and that sometimes the most dangerous people were the ones who looked the most harmless.